In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the order that we need to carry out operations and the concept of substitution. Now, the first thing we'll need to remember is what the word BODMAS stands for, and that of course tells us what order that we do things in maths. And so we always do brackets first, and then we move on to powers of. Now the powers of are like here, 5 squared or cubed or something like that is a powers of, and so is square roots, incidentally. They're a power of as well. And then some people actually have this as an I, and they call it BIDMAS, and the I stands for index numbers because that is an index number there, the 2. That's what's technically called. The next one is division, and then multiplication, and then addition and subtraction. And we want to remember that division and multiplication, they can be done in either order, and so can addition and subtraction. So if you've only got divisions and multiplications to do, you just go left to right. Same with additions and subtractions. Now, we'll also want to remember that in maths, letters represent unknown numbers. So when you see x plus 3, it means some number plus 3. Now also, if we've got a letter and a number right next to each other, then they're being multiplied. So 5y is the same as 5 times y. And same as if we've got two letters right next to each other. They are automatically being multiplied as well, and so that's the same as a times b. So we don't worry about writing the multiplication sign there, but we are multiplying, which is good, because if we wrote down the multiplication signs, they look a bit like x's there. So it's nice not to have to write them down when you're doing algebra. Now, finally, letters can actually be replaced with the numbers if we're told what numbers to use, what numbers the letters represent. So in this one here, it's asking us to evaluate 3x plus 2. It tells us that x is 5. And so that means that instead of going 3 times x plus 2, I could make that 3 times 5 plus 2. And then I could then go on to work that out. Notice I had to put the times sign in there because here I didn't need to. That's a letter and a number. Here it's now just 2 numbers. So I had to put the times sign back in. Remember, it is there. We just don't write it down. Moving on to the key points of the lesson, the first one is that we always use BODMAS. It doesn't matter what sort of maths you're using, everyone has to use BODMAS to know what order to do things in. And we evaluate things one step at a time, going downwards. And so when I've got here 3 times 8 minus 7, I could just work that out in my head, and maybe you could as well, but I'm not going to here. I'm going to use BODMAS to know, okay, I've got to do multiplication before subtraction, and so I'm going to work that out first. So 3 times 8 is 24. I'm actually going to write that down underneath. I didn't use the minus 7, so I'm just going to copy that down and put it afterwards, just like it is up here. And so now I can work out 24 take away 7, and of course that is 17. And so you're going down the page because we don't want multiple equal signs going across. Unless we just going straight to the answer, we always go down the page. And we do things one step at a time to clearly show what order we're doing things in. Now, the next thing is that a number always has its sign in front of it. And so when we're looking at this expression here, we'll have to do the multiplication first. That comes before the minus. Okay, remember this is a negative sign here, not a minus. But when we do it, we actually have to consider this as -3. And this is the tricky thing, that subtractions can double up as negative signs. And so if I look at this and go, well, that's 6 minus 3, sure, that's one way of looking at it. But if I'm just looking at this 3 and I say, what's that worth? Well, it's actually worth -3. So we always keep in mind that whenever we're doing timesing or whatever, just have a look in front, because if it's a minus there, that's actually -3 that you'll be working out. Speaking of negatives, we'll want to be very careful when we are substituting with negatives, especially if they're being squared. So first, let's look at this one. We've got 4 minus 8. Now, if I tell you that x is equal to -2 here, then it's very tempting just to write down 4 take away 2. But that would be ignoring this sign here. See, it's 4 take away and then -2. So you've actually got to write it down as 4 take away, that's these ones here, and then -2, which is the x. And then you can just work it out normally. That's minus minus a negative is the same as plussing, so that's really 4 plus 2, which is 6. The other one is to do with squaring. So if you've got x squared, and then let's say I told you x was -3, and so I'm working out -3 squared, then first of all, put your signs, so put your number in brackets. If it's negative and you're squaring it, always put it in brackets. There's two good reasons for that. One is because it helps it make clear for us, and two is because if you're using a calculator, which you won't be at the moment, but if you were, then it makes it very clear to the calculator as well, because if you don't use the brackets on the calculator, it actually gets this answer wrong. And so this is -3 times -3, which is actually positive 9. And so be very careful. Don't just sort of write this down and then go, oh, well, so that's -9. Think it through. It's a negative times a negative, which is actually a positive answer. So let's take a look at some examples, and the first one, we're going to use order of operations to evaluate this thing right here. So let's write it all down. Notice the only difference I've done is I didn't write the brackets that are just around the -3. You don't need to write down brackets if they're just around a single number and it's not being squared or anything. Notice I did use these brackets because they're around two numbers, and so I had to do them, but I didn't need the ones just around the -3. So I've written it down. Now I've got to work out what goes first. Well, BODMAS says B is first, so that's brackets first. That's these guys here. And so 6 take away -3. Take away a negative makes a plus. Now if you want to, you can circle this and you can put a plus above it and do whatever you need to, or you don't have to. The point of this question isn't do you know how to subtract negatives, it's do you know how to use BODMAS. So that's the working we're showing, and so you can just do this part in your head. The 6 minus -3, that's the same as 6 plus 3, which is 9. Now notice I've written the 9 down here, and then the -2 times 4 all just gets written down as well. And then we have a look. We forget that. That's gone. Ignore that now. Have a look at this line here. What goes next? Is it the minus or is it the times? And BODMAS says the multiplication's got to go before the subtraction. But here we're working out -2 times 4. Remember that number's always got its sign in front of it. So what's -2 times 4? Well, it's -8. And so on the next line down, I write 9, and I just write -8. And now, remember, I can look at that as either a negative or a subtraction. So now I'm just seeing it as 9 minus 8, which is equal to 1. Now you get used to this idea of always, the sign in front tells you whether it's positive or negative, and you use it that way. You get used to seeing these as both negatives and subtractions depending on the way that you're looking at them. So with the next example, we're going to evaluate y squared minus x, and we have to use x is -2 and y is -5. Now we're going to be very careful because we're substituting into negatives here. And so the first thing I can write down here, I don't need to write down y squared minus x. The first thing I can write down is the substitution. So I can actually put the numbers in place of the letters. So I write down -5 squared, because remember it's y squared, and it says y is -5, so I write down -5 squared, making sure I put my brackets around the negative, and then it's minus x, so that means it's going to be minus -2, not just -2, minus -2. And so now I can start working this out. Now BODMAS says do brackets first. These brackets here, there's only one number inside them then, so we can't really do anything there. They're done. We don't need to worry about that. Really, the brackets are just there to remind us to square the entire the negative, not just the 5. And so we'll move straight on to the of, which is the powers of the squared, and so -5 times by -5 is equal to 25. So we write down 25, and we write this part down as well. Now if you change that to +2 on that line, that would be fine as well, because you know that 2 minus a negative is a plus. You can write that down. So if you wrote down 25 plus 2, that would be okay. And now we're working out whatever this line says. So this is 25 minus -2, which is the same as 25 plus 2, and so that equals 27. And so going down our page there and being very careful with those negatives. Okay, let's try some practice questions here. And in this one, in this first one, just note that a square root sign there, that goes under the powers of part, so the O there. Remember to be careful with your negatives when you substitute in part B, and remember to pause the video. And there are the solutions with all the working that you should be showing going down your page. Looking at this first one here, now this is a big long question, but as long as we do it step by step, it should be relatively straightforward. So I started by writing the whole thing down, and then what I need to do is what order we do things in. Well, brackets go first, so I've got to do everything in the brackets there. So 4 minus the square root of 25, and because the square root of 25 is a power of, that comes before the minus. So the first thing I worked out was a square root of 25. I wrote it down underneath. I kept everything else the same. The next one I had to do was still in the brackets here, is the minus. So 4 take away 5, and that is -1. So I wrote that down. I kept everything else the same. And then I had to do the multiplication before this subtraction here. When I did that, it was -2 times -1. Remember, kept the sign with the number. So -2 times -1 is +2. And so I wrote that down and kept the 3 by itself there, sorry, the same. And finally, I get to use the 3 because all is left is 3 plus 2, and so that equals 5. The second one, after you've done the substitution, was actually a little bit easier. So we had to put in -5 and -3, and so -3 squared there, yeah, because y is the same as is -3 there. And then remember, we had to go minus -5, so we had to be careful there to go minus -5. So I worked out -3 squared first, which is +9, and I just wrote down the rest, and then all I had left was 9 minus -5. That's the same as 9 plus 5, which is 14. Here's some more practice questions if you need to give either one of them another go. Remember to pause the video. And there's our solutions to those. Hopefully you had a bit more luck with those ones and got them right, but if not, remember to seek some extra help. And that brings us to the end of the lesson.